What's up, everyone? Hope everyone is doing well. Haven't posted a video in a little bit, so wanted to plan out a pretty good one for you guys, and I think this one could help a lot of you people if you try to open up your mind and try to listen and fully understand it. Today I got a special guest with you, my brother, Ethan, and we're here to talk about your ego, what is your ego, how to understand your ego, and how this can help your life. So, Ethan, do you want to start by defining your ego and explaining it to all the viewers?
Sure. Well, your ego is very complicated, but at the same time it's very simple. And Caleb and I have broken it down a few ways. But to me, the ego is a person's self-esteem and importance, and basically any kind of self-identity or self-validity that makes you you. So my ego knows that I'm Ethan. I know that I'm from Illinois, Deerfields, and through contrasting myself and the environment through my internal sense of self, I'm able to identify who I am versus the external world.
Right, so your ego kind of floats between consciousness and unconscious beliefs. That's what we were saying before, and this is what kind of forms biases. So do you want to kind of explain what we mean by that?
Of course. So, the ego is here to protect you, right? So humans have evolved to have a strong ego because over time, humans don't necessarily have the fastest legs or the most muscles. We have the brains.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that necessarily protection is always the right way. We live in a modern society where a lot of the time we do things that we listen to our egos, but in the long run we end up realizing, oh wait, maybe if I shouldn't have listened to my ego in the first place and done, X thing to make myself uncomfortable in this situation and not listening to my ego, such as for example, a bias or a stereotype can sometimes lead from an ego, and not necessarily listening to those may lead someone to a better life.
Right, so I really liked when you said that our ego is essentially our protector. So I like to think about the ego as kind of the background chatter in our head, and anyone that meditates or can just journal and sit with their thoughts, or pretty much anyone that just tries to be aware, we all understand that there's always this internal voice in our head telling you, almost like we feel that they're there to sabotage us. But if we truly take a step back and try to look at what the origins of the ego is, you can kind of see that ego is just trying to protect you. So I heard this man talk about a good way to think about it is when we're driving our cars or something, sometimes we like to dance and sing something that we would feel is totally embarrassing, or in the shower, but because you are by yourself, you can do it, you feel that no one else is judging you, but the second that you stop at a red light and you look to the person next to you, you kind of just sit like this, totally embarrassed if you saw them, but ultimately you have to understand that the embarrassment is not really you, but another voice inside your head telling you to be embarrassed.
What do you mean by that?
So most people...
Like the voice inside your head is your ego, you're saying?
Yes.
Okay. And what happens if your ego is telling you to stop dancing for the situation?
The most important thing that I think you can do is try to understand that your ego is essentially trying to protect you from, in this case, from embarrassment of this person seeing you and judging you. But ultimately, if you understand that the only reason they're judging you is because they too have an ego, saying that they have an internal voice in their head saying, if someone saw me doing that, I would be embarrassed. Therefore, I'm going to judge them. But if you can fully accept your ego and say that maybe I was a little embarrassed, but ultimately, I'm having a good time, I don't care if I'm embarrassed, and just kind of accept it, say thank you for watching out for me, but really it's not a big deal, then you just feel a little bit more free. And it's just a constant pattern that we can do this, whether it's stage fright or other things that make us anxious, approaching someone and talking, and just kind of saying to yourself, thank you for... It's just kind of this idea that you want unconditional self-acceptance, and that's one of the things that people preach in spiritual journeys and psychologists, that ultimately if you can truly accept yourself, then you can truly accept others. And until you can accept yourself, you really can't accept others. And it all comes down to that way of listening, the way that we choose to interpret the voice in our head.
Right. And so it's not necessarily that the ego is incorrect, but it's our perception on what the ego is seeing via the eyes of the physical universe.
Exactly. So instead of us saying, I'm so nervous, I don't want to talk in front of people because usually I trip up on my words and I can't think clearly and I'm just not going to do it. In that case, you let the ego win. You don't expose yourself into these uncomfortable situations, and the reality of it is the more that you do this, the easier it becomes. Instead, you have to say, I feel like I'm going to throw up, and I love that. I love that I have this thing in my body that is watching out for me. And the second you can say that, the fear kind of subsides, and you see that it's just as if your mom was right next to you, saying, you got this, it's a little bit scary, but you got this. And you can kind of say that to yourself in your head.
Right, and even if the fear doesn't necessarily subside, you're still able to go on about doing your day while feeling embarrassed or discouraged and still be able to perform regardless of those negative feelings that your ego is giving you because it's trying to protect you.
Mm-hmm. Right, so you can look at your ego in two different ways. You can look at your ego as your best friend, like we're trying to interpret it into a way that it can be your best friend, and it can be the thing that's watching out for you, and sometimes it could annoy you, but ultimately you love it because it's trying to help you, and whether or not it's helping you in the right way, you can see that its intention is to help you, which is great. Or you can view it as your worst enemy and push it out as hard as you can, and the more that you try not to, or the more that you don't accept this, the more pain it ultimately will cause you.
Right, so what do you think is the best way to go about, having a good perspective? Like, how can I let go of these negative feelings without trying to push them or hide them down, making them seem almost louder and push back harder?
Right. So I think the biggest problem that people have, including myself, we're all work in progress, but we all feel that we want to be perfect in some way. And by us saying that we want to be perfect, that we can't accept our negative thoughts, that's really when the trouble starts. The second you start getting an anxious thought or a depressive thought in your head, and the second you say, I shouldn't have that thought, and it turns into a cycle where you say, I shouldn't have this thought, but it won't stop, and you just get mad at yourself. But the second that you're able to say, it's okay that I have this thought, a lot of people have this thought, and I'm just gonna accept it. And the second you're able to do that, and it's way easier said than done, but the second that you're able to do that, or even slightly, the easier it gets. And the more that you do this, in any sense, you just practice, and the better you get. So there are a couple ways that you can do this, one of which I've been preaching multiple times on this channel is to meditate and to sit with your thoughts. And I currently have been struggling with a certain reoccurring thought. And one of the new meditation techniques I've been doing is I sit down for 20 minutes and I ask myself in my head, I say, what am I resisting? What thought do I get normally over and over that I'm resisting? And you force yourself to sit with that thought and understand that, yeah, you're a little bit anxious at this time and it kind of sucks, but you realize that you can just sit with it and that's totally fine. And the more you do it, the more you realize that it is just a thought and it's just kind of there, but just because it's there, it doesn't mean that it has to control you.
Right, and just because we're talking about these subjects doesn't mean that we're experts.
Exactly.
We're still experiencing life through the human experience, and through that experience, of course, you and me both feel both sides of the spectrum. We feel very happy on some days, we feel very upset with some days, but the best thing about it is me and you don't let it affect us that much. And like you said, meditation's a great way to do it. And you were talking about basically a technique called noting, noting how you feel and seeing these thoughts pass through your head, but instead of identifying and attaching yourself to these thoughts or reoccurring, messages in your brain, because we can't control our thoughts. After all, they're just thoughts. You just say, okay, I notice these thoughts, and I'm just gonna let it go by.
Right. So, what Ethan means by a noting technique is, it's a little bit different than what I was just describing, but this is a classic meditation technique and practice, and it's actually, I just saw a study done by Carnegie Mellon, and they noticed a 50% reduction in any emotion for people that consistently practice noting meditation, which I think is pretty impressive considering there's really nothing else that you can do for yourself that can really make those profound effects without taking some type of medicine or something. So the way that you do this is when you're meditating, you kind of envision your mind as a blue sky. And every time you get a thought, you see that as a cloud that enters the sky. And the second that you say, oh, there's another cloud, just like, oh, that's just a thought, then you can kind of just watch the thought and watch it pass along in the sky. But the second you say, why is that thought there, or try to attach to the thought, all of a sudden, all your energy is focused on this cloud and you want to follow it. You'll get in your car and you'll drive with the cloud and you'll follow it. And it's not until you realize that you can't push that thought away that it'll stay with you. Instead, you just note it, think about it as just a thought, and remove yourself. And the more that you do this, you realize that you aren't your thoughts. They don't control you. They're just there, your ego, to protect you. And once you can interpret that, then essentially you can be free.
Right, and I think that's really really good representation of the fluidity of life and showing, the impermanence. A lot of us are struggling with this right now, especially with Corona. Everyone's like, what am I going to be certain about my future? Which would cause a lot of security and and with security comes positivity. But I think with Corona and with the uncertainty, now we're starting to realize that you don't have to be secure to be happy.
Exactly.
You can be okay with not knowing what's going to happen, and you can be okay with understanding that nothing in life is going to be permanent, especially because at the end of the day, it seems unfortunate, but we all die. And it's not that unfortunate, because as much as we all think that we're special, no one's more valuable than one another, and that's why I think it's important that we all help each other as much as we can. And I think meditation's a great place to start with yourself and to spread it to as many friends as possible is the main idea.
Right, and another thing that you said during that was that it's okay to not know. And if you really look at all of our suffering in life, it really originates in the head, and that is you're either focused on what's going to happen and you're stressed or anxious about that, or you're focused on what did happen, I should have said this, and you're depressed that you didn't do this or the outcome wasn't as it was supposed to go. But essentially, if you can train yourself to live in the current moment and just understand that all that you have is right now and all your suffering is from the head, and if you just focus on right now, then you can truly always be content and always be happy. Another way that you can cope with understanding your ego, if meditation really isn't your thing, is to journal, is to have an underlying question and just answer it. Maybe you have an entire page and you say, I'm going to fill up this page. And the question could be the same thing that I was saying. What thoughts are you resisting? And you kind of just write about it and don't really think. You just let your ego kind of write and say, what am I resisting? Why am I resisting? And then you kind of just see oh, this is happening here, but I'm not going to let it control me. And once you're able to see it, then again, you're one step closer to understanding it and living with it.
Right. You want to not only feel your feelings, but you also want to challenge them. You can't just go in life saying, well, I feel this way, and therefore I'm going to do blank.
Right. And then the last thing that I wanted to say that you can do to cope with this understanding is to just simply talk about it. Similar to how I'm doing this now, this in it of itself is a form of practice and a meditation for me to then go out and say and explain to you guys that the ego is not you and it shouldn't define you, is a way for me to remind myself that. So the next time that I'm tripped up in a situation, I can just tell myself, this isn't me. I love that I'm getting nervous right now because it's protecting me. And so what if I'm a little nervous? And so what if things don't end up that I originally intended. But the second that I let it take over me and get upset about it is the second that I ruin the situation overall.
Right, especially because your ego is essentially trying to protect you from death, and now that we've ruled out that death is is actually not as evil as our society makes it out to be, what are you protecting yourself from? Just yourself, just your own thoughts, and there's nothing to be running away from.
Right. I think that's a great note to end on. Hope you guys enjoyed this one. Leave any comments below. Thank you.